In just 8 seconds, an Air Force jet went from perfectly stable to a fatal, unstoppable dive. The crew suddenly floated weightless, electrical power vanished, and the aircraft pitched over so violently that every second determined life or death. And by the time the pilot reached for the only switch that could save them, it was already too late. Today, we're breaking down the 8-second autopilot malfunction that doomed a United States Air Force flight. A tragedy so sudden and so bizarre that investigators later said, if action is delayed 8 seconds, the aircraft cannot be controlled. On May 6, 1981, a Boeing EC-135N radar tracking aircraft, callsign AGAR 23, lifted off from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. It was a routine training mission: climb to altitude, track a missile test range, return home. On board were 21 people, 17 crew, 4 passengers, and 1 person who absolutely should not have been sitting where she was. The aircraft commander's wife, occupying the co-pilot's seat as part of an observer program. The Air Force shut down immediately after this flight. The aircraft climbed smoothly to 29,000 feet. Weather was perfect, systems normal, autopilot engaged. No one on board had any warning that the most catastrophic trim runaway failure in EC-135 history was silently beginning. To understand what went wrong, here's a quick explanation of the system that doomed the flight. The entire horizontal stabilizer, the full tailplane, moves using a powerful trim motor. Trim adjusts the pitch of the aircraft to keep it level. But if the trim runs uncommanded, especially to a full nose-down position, it can force the airplane into a dive so aggressive that the elevators cannot overcome it. That's why this aircraft had a trim cutout switch. One flip immediately stops the runaway motor, but on AGAR 23, nobody noticed the trim was creeping nose down, all the way to the stop. And when the autopilot finally released it, the aircraft snapped forward into a dive so violently that everyone on board experienced zero gravity. The aircraft was cruising normally when the autopilot system did something investigators still cannot fully explain. It began driving the stabilizer trim forward, little by little, toward a full nose-down position. At first, the autopilot masked the problem by holding altitude. But inside the tail, the trim motor kept pushing and pushing and pushing until it finally hit full nose down. At that point, the autopilot had no choice but to disconnect. And the moment it let go, everything changed instantly. The jet pitched violently forward. The nose dropped so fast that the aircraft briefly entered negative G. Crew members were thrown upward. Loose objects floated. People were weightless. And at that same instant, the aircraft lost electrical power. The cockpit plunged into chaos. Investigators later calculated, if corrective action is delayed approximately 8 seconds, the pitch will exceed 30 degrees nose down and cannot be controlled. AGAR 23 now plunged downward, picking up speed rapidly. 350 knots, 400 knots. The sensation of falling was overwhelming. Every second mattered. Inside the cockpit, the crew was disoriented. The pilot was pinned forward by the deceleration. The co-pilot's seat was occupied by the commander's wife, who wasn't trained to help. The actual flight crew scrambled into position, fighting the effects of weightlessness. Someone shouted, "Trim! Trim runaway!" But recognition came seconds too late. The pilot wrestled the yoke with maximum force, but the stabilizer, locked in full nose down, drove the airplane downward like a spear. The only salvation was the trim cutout switch, a single toggle that would disable the runaway motor instantly. But the pilot couldn't reach it right away. Those lost seconds sealed the aircraft's fate. Investigators reconstructed the moment frame by frame. At the instant of autopilot disconnect, the pilot had about 8 seconds, maybe 10 at most, to stop the runaway trim. But the cockpit was barely functional. People were floating, alarms blaring, objects hitting the ceiling. And by the time the pilot finally managed to reach out and flip the trim cutout switch, it was too late. The stabilizer was now locked in full nose down. The aircraft was diving at more than 30 degrees, accelerating past 350 knots and becoming unrecoverable. The dive had become ballistic. AGAR 23 shot downward through the clouds at terrifying speed. The pilot pulled with everything he had: full aft yoke, full power, maximum elevator authority. But the stabilizer trim, frozen at full nose down, overpowered everything. 29,000 feet. 20,000. 15,000. There was no time for a proper distress call. No checklist could be followed. No recovery procedure existed for this type of runaway at this speed and angle. At around 1,500 feet, structural forces on the fuselage became extreme. Fuel vapor, pressure, and aerodynamic stress combined into catastrophic failure. The aircraft exploded in mid-air, breaking apart over farmland near Walkersville, Maryland. All 21 people aboard were killed. 21 lives lost because of a mechanical malfunction measured in seconds. The Air Force investigation reached several important conclusions. First, this was a mechanical and control system failure. There was no misconduct, no sabotage, no pilot error. Second, the autopilot was driving the trim system to a more nose-down position without cockpit indication early enough for anyone to notice. Third, the trim cutout switch was thrown, but far too late. Once the aircraft exceeded a certain pitch angle and speed, it was physically impossible to recover. Fourth, a reaction just a few seconds earlier would likely have saved the flight. Investigators stated, if corrective action had been taken approximately 8 seconds earlier, recovery would have been possible. And finally, observer-in-cockpit programs were suspended after this crash. The presence of a non-rated person in the co-pilot's seat slowed response during the most critical moment. This was not a case of pilot carelessness. It was a case of a perfectly normal flight, a sudden catastrophic malfunction, a tiny window for recognition, and then an unstoppable dive. Every crew member did what they could under impossible conditions. The pilot still managed to hit the cutout switch, but only after being thrown around the cockpit during the zero-gravity pitch over. There was no surviving this. It was a brutal demonstration of how even a massive aircraft can be defeated by a single runaway system in less than 10 seconds. Runaway trim failures are among the most dangerous events in aviation. Modern systems now include better protections, stronger monitoring, clearer cockpit warnings, stricter rules for cockpit occupancy, and more rigorous autopilot testing. But AGAR 23 remains a chilling reminder. A jet can be lost in seconds, and when a critical system fails silently, even highly trained crews may never get the chance to act in time. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think modern systems could prevent a disaster like this today? And if you want more breakdowns of aviation's most shocking and least known incidents, make sure you subscribe. Because there are stories out there even more unbelievable than this one.